Hello and welcome. This will be a class more about Chanukah than a parsha. Chanukah, most people know in, as the story of the dreidel, latkes, food, and the Greeks, a dreidel, and the miracle of the oil. Yet behind this story, the narrative. Um, lies a lot of history and lots of oppression which happened to the Israelite nation in Israel, religious persecution, very courageous resistance, and for many an ultimate self-sacrifice for the time. Today we'll go a little bit deeper into that story and hearing some of the history that surrounds it around that main miracle. First thing is just to put on the table and define that, as you probably know, that the miracle is because of the oil, an oil cruise, a jug, which was sized for usage for one day, miraculously lasted for 8 days. Our sages talk about that event, even though there was many miraculous other stories. The miracle of the of the oil is what's underlined as the main miracle. So we will talk about that at the end, but I want to briefly and also not so briefly cover some historical points that were involved in the Hanukkah story. In ancient Israel, at the time of the death of Alexander the Great, his vast empire was divided amongst his generals and eventually forming kingdoms which related to Greece, Egypt, and Syria. So in around about 3586 in the Hebrew calendar, which is 174 BCE, the Antiochus, the fourth, became ruler of the kingdom of Syria, and they were the Seleucids, which their area of control included the land of Israel. During that time, because it was dominated by the culture of Greece, during that time, many Jews were drawn to Hellenistic culture, its Greek values, customs, and there was a level of assimilation into pagan practices, while many of the Jewish nation remained faithful to their ancestral traditions. Antiochus was angered that people weren't assimilating in the melting pot that he wanted. And he was angered by the refusal of the underlings under his empire to conform to them. In Israel, the high priest at the time was a righteous man. His name was Yochanan, and he upheld Jewish law and tradition. He had a brother, though, and his brother had embraced Hellenistic ways, and he called himself Jason. Now, this Jason bribed Antiochus with, as recorded in the Book of the Maccabees, 60 silver kikar. It's a huge amount of weight of gold to secure the position of high priest for himself, displacing the righteous Yochanan. Once he got power, Jason introduced numerous Greek customs into Jewish life, including building a massive sports center in Jerusalem. The Greeks, as you know, with the Olympics, made that an important edifice in their life. And this was a symbol of assimilation and pagan influence. So more about that you can find in the book of Maccabees, in Book of Maccabees 2. In a few years later, another person. Now, he was no longer of, this other person was no longer of the family of Kohanim or priests. He wasn't priestly at all, but he amassed a larger fortune and he wanted to take over the priesthood. His name was Menelaus, and he was not of priestly family, and he offered Antiochus an even larger bribe to secure to become the high priest, and Antiochus accepted, and he removed Jason from office. So at that time as well, Antiochus had political interests. He was engaged in a military campaign in Egypt, and a false rumor circulated that he actually had been killed in war, and taking advantage of the confusion about who was in control. Jason attacked Jerusalem to reclaim his position. Uh, this Jason, he killed many Jews, ousted Manasseh from power, and meanwhile, in Egypt, Roman ambassadors arrived to stop Antiochus' campaign. They demanded that he stop immediately. They stopped his war campaign, and that ended his operations in Egypt and Cyprus, and made him stop. So he was now Antiochus was now very upset. The Romans had interfered with his larger political conquests, and he was enraged by reports that Jason had attacked the person that he put in as high priest. So Antiochus eventually returns to Israel, determined to punish the Jewish people. After Antiochus returned from his campaign in Egypt, he entered Jerusalem, and tens of thousands of Jews were killed. Manasseh was reinstated as the high priest, and in a shocking show of desecration, a pagan altar was erected in the Holy Temple. So that this is this is detailed in the book of Maccabees, and it mentions that they set up an idol on the altar, built pagan shrines in every Jewish city. They offered pagan sacrifices and incense in the streets of the different cities, and it forced a change of the religious attitude amongst everywhere. They took the precious Torah scrolls, burnt them. Anyone found with anything of original Jewish scrolls, or anyone who observed Jewish law was killed as the king had commanded. So angered further by the Jewish people, Antiochus issued a number of serious hard decrees aiming at eradicating their faith. So there was a lot of pain. Antiochus understood that the core values of the Torah, the observance of mitzvahs, sanctity of Shabbos, circumcision, and other commandments were the foundation of Jewish faith. So he outlawed these basic practices. The king's decree carried an ultimate penalty, which was death. And to the extent that if somebody circumcised their child, even though they went with the level of self-sacrifice, all three, mother, father, and child, were all killed and hanged for defying the law. Another story tells of an elderly sage of 90 years old who was commanded by Antiochus' service to publicly eat non-kosher food, pork. And when he refused even to pretend to eat, they executed him. So there are many, there are a number of stories in Nicholas Antiochus which speaks about episodes of different devotion that forced people to go underground, that forced groups of Jews to leave Jerusalem, hide in caves, hoping to keep the Jewish religion alive in secret in different areas. But if they were found out by the Antiochus' generals, they were unfortunately they were all killed, right, and they weren't allowed to keep their traditions. A very famous story is the story of Hannah and her 7 sons, where Hannah is asked to take her 7 sons, and each one of them each one of them is asked to bow down to the king or to the idol, and the king says to Chanukah, "Why do you want your children killed?" And she says, "No, we have to do this for the for Hashem." Um, they took out each one by one. When it came to the last child, he said to the mother, um, "Do you want to sacrifice your last child? You get your last child. And let's do a ruse. I'll throw my ring on the floor. You you pretend that you're bowing down, but instead you're just picking up that ring, and that way you'll have one child left." And so, as the episode is is discussed, that young boy says back to the emperor, and he says, "Emperor, woe unto you if you believe that obeying your command for the sake of your honor is correct, rather than the sake of the Holy One. I would definitely obey your, but I prefer to obey the King of all kings." And um, so so she says, and the king is enraged, and the king demands that he be killed, and they let him out to kill. And as he was going out, his mother says to him, I'm quoting from the Megillus Antiochus. She says, "My son, go and say to your father Abraham that you bound only one son to the altar, but I've given 7 children, 7 altars." And then with that, the child was killed, and she also went up to the roof, and she fell and she died. And a divine voice came out and said that this is a wondrous event, and that she had raised her children to be devoted in the service of God. So as the history talks, that there was this massive period of um, of of being forced to be involved in another religion and keeping the religion. Meanwhile, we have the story how our tradition of how dreidels, spinning the top, came about. As persecution intensified, many Jews fled to the hills on the outskirts of Israel, of Judea, seeking to preserve the Torah and their traditions in secret. So these soldiers of the Syrian general, and we call them Syrian Greek because they were originally Syrian, but under the influence of the Greek nation, the Syrian Greek soldiers continued their search for anyone still observing Torah law, but inside the caves, the Jewish people gathered and studied Torah. But if police or if the generals were coming or approaching them, the children would quickly hide anything related to Yiddishkeit, their scrolls of teaching, and bring out spinning tops to play with, pretending to play instead of studying Torah. And this clever trick gave birth to the tradition of the dreidels, which is custom to people that people play with on the festival of Chanukah. Now, the deeper concept behind that was that the Syrian Greeks themselves didn't oppose as much the wisdom of Torah, the deepness of Torah, but they were opposed to recognizing that what they were doing was connecting to Hashem and observing the mitzvahs because Hashem gave it to us. So in deeper tradition, we understand that the Syrian Greeks weren't opposed to wisdom per se. After all, the Greeks and the Greek tradition puts wisdom and understanding on a high pedestal. What they were opposed to was the idea that this is a godly wisdom, that this is God's Torah. Now, that expression is embedded in our prayers. Now, I'll get to that shortly. But what their goal was to lashkicham teresecho, to make them forget their Torah. But the expression is teresecho, which means your God's Torah. The idea that the object that they were trying to take away was to take away the godly influence, the godly essence of Torah, those parts of the Torah which Jews keep, and it's obvious in them that these parts of the Torah transcend any logical explanation. They transcend the concept of intellect. This is not necessarily wisdom in the eyes of the Greek, in the eyes of secularists. So likewise, they sought to make people abandon the laws of your will. And the expression is in the prayers is Rotzanecha, because Hashem has given us those laws, as we've learned, that we can understand the Jewish laws under a threefold for framework, one of logical laws, mishpatim, one of laws which relate to the different festivals, and one of those laws which are called chukim, which chukim refer to the laws kept purely because they express God's desire, God's will. So, in fact, the Syrian Greeks could tolerate Jews performing mitzvahs if they were explained logically to them, as if their value came from human understanding. But what they could not tolerate was Judaism rooted in the idea of doing this simply because this is God's will, as we said, the expression Rotzanecha, Hashem's will, His will, and we do it just because Hashem has told us to do. That's what we call Kabbalah Soul, accepting the yoke of heaven. And in fact, this was one of the core of the struggle. In fact, the core of the struggle, not against Torah knowledge per se, but because of the godly, super-rational commitment to what defines Jews' bond to God. So at this period of time, there was a priest named Matisyahu. He was actually the son of that Yochanan, that former high priest who Jason had pushed out. Matisyahu, and he had 5 brave sons. Their names were Yehuda, Yochanan, Shimon, Eliezer, and Yonasan. They were very deeply loyal to the Torah. They began a revolt against the Syrian Greek armies. So it started one day in the marketplace where they lived. Madain, where a group of soldiers publicly challenged Matisyahu, demanding that he bring a pagan offering to please Antiochus. Now, the detail of this story is actually put and mentioned in the book of Maccabees, and of how the officers came and had told him and that he has to bend to the will of Antiochus. So the king's officers told Matisyahu and said, look, you're a very famous person, you're an influential person, you have many sons, you're an influential family. So we want you to be the first to carry out the king's commandment of putting those pagan altar in the middle of your area, of your city, just as others across the kingdom and even other people of Jerusalem have already done so. And if you do this, we'll slip you the bribe, we'll slip you the money, you will earn the king's favor, and you'll be rewarded with lots of gold, silver, and precious gifts. So Matisyahu raised his voice and said, even if everybody forces me, I won't do it. It won't happen with me or any member of my family, and we won't change from our traditions. And he was and he stood up publicly in the town square, and he said, "We won't be adopting the king's religion or exchange our laws for his." So he knew that this was, meant that for him this was a death penalty, um, um, and uh, and some other person, as he was speaking, some other person came forward and wanted to be the first one to offer a pagan sacrifice, and Matisyahu burnt with the passion of the Torah, for his passion for Hashem, and he ran in fury towards this person, killed him, and next to the king official, he then tore down the altar, and he ran through the city, and he gathered people together, and he said, "Whoever is strong for the Torah of Hashem and stands firm in his covenant, come with me." So Matisyahu and his 5 sons escaped the city, and with many still loyal to Judaism, they fled to the desert mountain, and they regrouped, and they started a plan to fight against the Syrian Greeks. As they were running this revolt, um, uh, this obviously took a large toll, and Matisyahu, his days were coming to an end. He called his sons together, and he told them to stand firm against this outrage that's happening in Israel, and they discussed a strategy with one of the sons, with Shimon, and he appointed the famous Yehuda HaMaccabee as to lead that battle. Now, all again, part of this history is in the book of the Maccabees. As the revolt and the guerrilla tactics were making some sort of effect and bothering the Antiochus, people came together, and they won victories against the Syrian Greek army, and their own force and their fearlessness became very difficult to ignore. So now the Syrian Greeks, who were now ran away strategically, and then telling Antiochus that he should send a massive army and against the Maccabees, who were now very strong. Now, miraculously, the great army turned up, but the guerrilla tactics of Yehuda and Shimon were successful, and miraculously the Jews triumphed in the war, and they drove away the enemy forces, compelling Antiochus to leave Israel and leave Israel in peace. So the summary of this events is very summarized in our prayers, which we add to our daily prayer, our daily Amidah prayer. We use the expression "Va'ata barachmecha rabim," in your great mercies, "Amata lehem be'etz sorosom," you stood by us in the time of our affliction, our distress. Aravta is rivom, you waged the wars. Verdanta is dinom, and you defended the rights, and you nikmasom, you avenged the wrong done to them. We were masartam giberim biyad chaloshim. You delivered the mighty into the hands of the weak, referring to, and we'll break this up in a minute, but you delivered the mighty, meaning the mighty armies, into the hands of the weak, because they were just a band of volunteers. Um, so you say, Giberim biyad chaloshim, the strong, the mighty were given to the hands of weak. Rabim biyad ma'atim, the many were put into the hands of the few. Tumeim biyad tahirim, and the impure into the hands of the pure, and the wicked into the hands of the righteous. So that and all of that, v'zedim biyad esketerasecho, and you put these sinners into the hands of those who occupy themselves with the Torah. So that is the words which we say, as I just said, those are the words which we say in our prayer. That's what's added into the prayer. Interestingly, the name Chanukah comes from the idea that um, that the military victory, it wasn't a complete victory, but it was the time when Jerusalem was then taken back and cleaned up of, and the temple area was cleaned up of the armies which were the opposing army, and that happened on the 25th of the month of Kislev. So Hanukkah, if you actually break up the word, so it's Chanukah Ko, which the Ko part is actually spelled as Chof Hey, which that's if you take the numerical equivalent of the word of the Chof Hey, that means the 25th. The letter Chof is 20, the letter Hey is 5, so that's the 25th. And Chanu means that they rested. So they rested from the war on the 25th. So that's how the name of Chanukah, the Chanukah name was derived. Now, Antiochus himself, when he first heard what had happened, he decided that he's going to avenge this, and he set out with men and his chariots towards Jerusalem, saying that he's going to destroy what happened. However, he was struck by some sort of illness on his way. He fell off his chariot. He broke his bones. He never recovered, and because he never recovered, even his soldiers refused to help him. His doctors, he shattered his body. He ultimately died far away from Judaism, and this was a dramatic collapse of the power he once arrogantly claimed. And again, that's detailed in the book of Maccabees. Now, coming back to the idea that I started with, that the miracle was the miracle of the oil. Now, there was a fantastic physical success via the army. The Syrian Greeks have now been deposed by a small, what's called a small band of men doing guerrilla tactics to push away the great armies. This was miraculous in itself, and was expressed in our prayers. But our Talmud tells us that the miracle that we observe for Hanukkah is because there was a rededication of the temple via this cruse of oil that was found. And in fact, another understanding of the word Chanukah is that from the word, which is based from the word of Chanukas Hamizbeach, a rededication of the altar. That means, or dedicating the altar, and this was rededicated with this cruse of oil. As we know the story, they cleaned the temple. They discovered that all the oil of the menorah had been defiled. The oil, in order to run the practices in the temple, the oil has to be pure and sealed with a seal proclaiming that its holiness. A particular None of these oil could be found. The Syrian Greeks had deliberately broken and contaminated every flask of oil because they wanted to, again, destroy any of the purity in the temple. But one cruse of oil, one flask of oil was found with the high priest's seal, and this um, um, this little bit of oil should have only lasted for the for the one day. The nearest supply of suitable oil is 8 days' journey, and that would have created a serious problem for lighting of the menorah. We discuss in the Talmud that miracle of the oil, and it was the new oil is produced in a place which is 4 days journey away, 4 days there, 4 days back. Right, that's the total of 8 days. So but the Talmud discusses that they found this little bit of oil, and that's the miracle which occurred, which allowed it to light for 8 days. So the Gemara, the Babylonian Talmud in Gemara Shabbos, Masechet Shabbos, Tractate Shabbos on 21b says that a miracle happened, and they lighted from that oil for 8 days. And that's what we do each night. We celebrate the Chanukah for 8 nights, and we include those passages which I mentioned before, the Malanis and prayer, in our daily prayers to remember that miracle and express our thanks. So there are other miracles that are mentioned, but the main one which is discussed is the idea of the oil. We discussed previously just that, the idea of keeping the rituals, keeping that holiness, keeping the Ritzonecha, the will of Hashem in there. So the Maccabees responded with the devotion that transcended logic. It was a readiness to give themselves up and give up everything for God. And so their self-sacrifice revealed the small cruse of pure oil, the physical one, but as well this pure level of oil, the neshama, the soul in every person, that inner point of the soul that stays completely pure, that won't allow itself to be defiled. And that's why the miracle had to happen with oil, because oil represents the inner purity of a person. So when the Maccabees found their inner strengths, and they uncovered their own pure oil, so at the end of the physical army's success, they've then found their own pure oil in a physical sense, that cruse of oil. And God revealed his hidden light in the world. And in return for their efforts, as the expression goes, midah keneged midah, one attribute in relationship to the other attribute, God had shown, since the Jewish people had shown the attribute of giving away everything for the purposes of the spirituality. So God, in return, replied by allowing the Jews to find this one cruse of oil, and God revealed that hidden light, that physical hidden light. So even though there were the miracles that the mighty fell to the weak, as we say in our prayers, Hashem showed us the miracle of the oil, and that oil, which was pure and which was good enough for one day, went beyond the standard. Any time it went beyond, anything goes beyond the standard, one day more, then that pure oil burnt for 8 days. 7 days represents, even one day extra is a miracle, but 7 days represents miraculous things which happened in the world. 8 days goes one beyond. So the Hashem showed us the oil which lasted for 7 plus 1, 8 days. Now, Chanukah reminds us that every Jew carries this indestructible spark. So when we connect to the godly core of our Torah mitzvahs, we reveal our own pure oil and we illuminate the world with a light that no force can dim. So that's why the core mitzvah of Hanukkah is lighting the menorah each night. And even though, as we said, there is the physical aspect of that of the waging of the war and being successful in the war, we we don't celebrate that as we do in other festivals. Other festivals in the Jewish calendar have a deliberate celebration with joy and food and wine, etc., as part of the celebration. In Hanukkah, the emphasis is on the purity of the oil, of the purity of the tradition, and seeing the miracle of that cruising oil. And the mitzvah of lighting is not just a private act, because its whole purpose is that we need to publicize the miracle which happened to us. And that's called, in Hebrew, we call it prasuma nissa, publicizing the miracle. And therefore, that's why we take our menorah and we stick it out in some sort of visible place, some sort of place that it's noticeable. And hence, we have some people have it out in the street. You know that in Jerusalem and Israel, people have it will have it at their front gate. We do in the Western world, and in other places in the world, we do it in with public menorah lightings, even though that might not necessarily be the ultimate purpose for your person. Everybody has to do it for themselves in their own house. Nevertheless, the purpose is that strangers or passers-by should be able to see it, and hence the Hanukkah parties and candle lightings in public places. All of this is that these celebrations reinforce the message of Hanukkah, of turning darkness into light and strengthening Jewish pride in all areas of our life. So with that, I'll leave you with that strong message of the purity of the Hanukkah menorah and the Hanukkah lighting, and the spreading of light in all the different places wherever we can. Okay, wishing you all a happy Hanukkah.